This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Mary, what was your favorite act of kindness that you've learned about so far on your cross-country travels?
The one that has probably had the largest impact on me was just a very small story that I received in the beginning of my mission. A woman emailed me this story, and she said that she had been a bank teller in the summer when she was younger, and she was having a really bad day at work. And she was at work, and it was visible on her face that she had maybe been crying earlier. And another young woman came into the bank and was withdrawing money. And she kind of looked at her, and she saw that she looked upset. And she said, "Are you okay? Is there anything I can do for you?" And the girl was really embarrassed. She didn't know the woman. And so she kind of said, "Oh, nothing some M&Ms won't fix when I get out of work later. Nothing big." And so they laughed, and the woman left. And then a half an hour later, that same woman came back in, slipped a bag of M&Ms under her window, and walked out. And it was just this tiny little act. But the woman was telling me this story 30 years later. She had never forgotten it. She told her kids and her grandkids. And, when I started this trip, I think that I thought maybe her boyfriend broke up with her, or maybe she stubbed her toe on the way to work. But as I've traveled around now into 40 states and to over 100 homes that I stay in, let alone the homes where I collect my stories, you realize, everyone's going through something pretty big. I mean, she could have been diagnosed with cancer that week. Her uncle could have died in a car accident. I mean, you have no idea what is going on with people, and tiny little things that we can all be doing. Because when people think of an act of kindness, they think, oh, someone donated a kidney to a stranger, or someone paid for someone to go to college, like these huge grand acts. But they're not. They can be these tiny little things that we are all capable of doing and can be doing more and can have really big impacts on people. I mean, this woman who got her the M&Ms probably has no idea that the girl has been telling the story for 30 years. So I just really love that story because I think it makes us kind of all remember we can be part of this and be doing more.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Mary Latham. She's a photographer and a blogger, and for the past 2 years, she's been on a trek across the country to find and document random acts of kindness. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today, we're going to talk with Mary about what inspired her to pack all of her belongings and hit the road to find the good in people. Mary Latham is in the middle of a one-of-a-kind trip that many can dream of, but few can do, which is to travel across all 50 states in America by car. What makes Mary's story even more unique is why she's doing it and what she hopes to find. Mary is looking for as many stories of human kindness as she can find and document them for a book she plans to write. She wants the book to be in hospital waiting rooms across the country. Mary's physical journey started in October 2016, but the idea came much sooner, in 2012. In the process, she has created a movement that she calls More Good. She can tell you how it started.
So I was working in New York at the time of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, and I had just gone into work that morning and pulled up my Google News and was kind of reading through, updating us. He was still an active shooter, and I just kept hitting the refresh button. And like everyone, I was absolutely horrified. And I was looking through it, and my coworker stopped by my desk, and he had a coffee from Starbucks with him. And he said, you should have come today. We used to go once a week together. And I said, no, I couldn't afford it. And I wasn't really paying attention to him. I was staring at my screen. And he said, no, it was free. And so I kind of finally turned around and looked at him, and I said, what are you talking about? And he said, yeah, there was a man in earlier buying gift cards for employees. And he kind of was getting some presents for Christmas for the employees because it was right before that time in December. And he got an extra one for $100 and told the barista to run it out on the line behind him. And my coworker at the time was 30 years old. He was going through a divorce. He was getting back surgery that year. He had lost his mother to cancer. And so it was kind of just not a great year for him. And I can still see his face. I mean, he was so excited about this free $4 coffee that a stranger had bought him. And so I called my mom after he left my desk. I would call her every morning and check in with her. And I told her the little story, and then I kind of quickly switched over to the shooting. We actually grew up without television, so she didn't know yet what had happened. And so I was telling her all about the news and how could this happen and how is there so much bad out there and how am I going to babysit this weekend for the 6-year-old that I have to babysit for without crying on her, and just really going on and on about how horrible it was. And she politely interrupted me and kind of said, Mary, you got to focus on that coffee story you just told me. You know, what a cool thing. And there's always going to be tragedies and horrible things that will inevitably happen in our life and in the world, but there'll always be more good out there if you look for it. And this is one of our last conversations that we had before she passed away from cancer. And so I kind of decided to take that little nugget of wisdom that she had and pack it up in her old Subaru Outback and go out there and find it and try to highlight it and create a book with all of these stories to donate to hospital waiting rooms, just because I spent a lot of my time in those rooms because she had cancer. And I just thought there's not really that much positive stuff in there. It was a very hopeless feeling. And wouldn't it be nice to create a book of hope for the people that have to sit in there next to kind of read through?
Well, before we talk about what you did next, I did want to ask you about your mother. What kind of person was she to give you that kind of advice? And it sounds like you and her were close.
Yeah, I'm the one of 4 children. I'm the bottom of the haystack. So when she was originally diagnosed with cancer, I was at home and my siblings had gone off to college by that point. So I was going into 8th grade, and she hid a lot of it from me. She really didn't want me to see how sick she was, but also always kind of reminded me that my positive attitude was what really helped her during that time. I was just like a really happy kid, and we had a really good relationship. And so that always impacted me. And then in 11th grade, I actually got really sick. My appendix burst and I got peritonitis and all these other issues, and was in the hospital for a little while. And she was there the entire time with me. So we kind of developed a really strong relationship, and it also kind of was based a little bit around a lot of the time in the hospital. She was just, I mean, the most positive person. She radiated kindness. She was never complaining. She was always smiling, no matter what was going on, and something was always going on with her, even during the 10 years where she was cancer-free. Every little thing and side effect and problem that she could have had, she had. And no one knew she was sick. No one knew when the cancer got back, except for close family or friends, because she was just always smiling and always helping, and just, she was a little bit more of like the quiet. I don't know if she would have gone out into the country like this, but she was like a kind of behind the scenes, just really, really kind person and just positive. I mean, it kind of always taught us, you know, everyone's going through something. You know, we kind of all have a choice. We're going to get dealt things that we're not going to want. And it's kind of how you're going to handle it and react to it. And so she was very inspirational for me to kind of not move on, but move forward with what I had to go through when I lost her, and kind of try to carry her spirit on and create something positive with it and keep her alive as much as possible.
Well, your mother's name was Pat, and she inspired you to go on and create a thing called the Gratitude Project. And that is what sort of bridged the gap between this devastating loss on your part and your decision to go across the country. Can you tell us a little bit about the Gratitude Project?
So the Gratitude Project was its original name. I've kind of changed it now to More Good, because that's what she said. That's what I'd like to call the book. That's what the website is. But it began as the Gratitude Project because I had met up with a friend shortly after the conversation I had with her. And we were talking, and the friend had gone through a really bad breakup, and I was coping with my mom's prognosis, and her cancer was getting worse. And, you know, I said, I really want to be talking about these stories more. And it was pretty funny, because as we're talking about this, my roommate sends me a text message and said she had gone out the night before in New York City, and she was with her coworkers, and she had been a little overserved at the bar, and she forgot her phone in the bottom of the cab. And she'd gotten out, and a man got in after her, and he found it on the ground, and it was dead. So he charged it, and then he used Surrey to call her last contact, which was her father. And he said, yeah, she lives in 1425 York Avenue. And the man delivered it to our building and handed it to her, which you don't usually hear about, let alone in New York City. So I just felt like, wow, these stories are out there, and wouldn't it be cool to highlight them? And she said, my friend said, yeah, I've been thinking about that too. I always wanted to do something positive and I wanted to call it the Gratitude Project. And so that's kind of where it began. She had come up with that name and we launched it as the Gratitude Project with 2 T's, like attitude, kind of a way of life or behavior of looking at things. And it was probably 11 days into the project before my mom ended up in the hospital and then passed away that week. So we kept it going, but it kind of was not, it always had the momentum in the beginning and people were sending stuff in, and then it kind of died out a little bit. And I decided that what I really wanted to create, instead of just sitting there because people weren't sending the stories in as much, and it was, instead of getting really discouraged with that and feeling like the project was failing, I decided I was going to go out there and find the stories myself. And that's kind of when I created this whole mission.
Let's talk about the life that you were actually giving up before you started this trip. You lived in New York City. You worked at a law firm. You also worked as a nanny for 2 families. And on the weekends, you were a wedding photographer. So you had a lot going on, and you were also making money. And here you decided to give that up to do what you're doing now. What was your life like, and how did you make that big decision?
Well, I didn't just leave New York City and get in the car. I actually, I did go back to work for a little while. And I think it was probably a few months after my mom passed that I ended up deciding to kind of make a really big leap of faith. I had a friend that lived in St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, and she had reached out right after the funeral and said, Mary, I've been thinking about you a lot, and I think that you should move down here. I think it'd be really good for you. You could go on some hiking. You could do your wedding photography full time, which is what you want to do, but you have to afford your rent. So you're doing all those other things. And, you can just try to get a little healing in. And I kind of laughed at the text and thought, yeah, wouldn't that be nice? My dad was falling apart. My family was all in New York still. We were all grieving. I had all of these jobs to figure out. I had a lease on an apartment. It was just so much stuff going on. And then I went out that week a couple days later with a friend. And she was going on and on about a Tinder date that she had gone on. And how unfortunate it was the guy wasn't calling her back, and how unfair it was, and her life is so unfair, and things were always bad for her, and she couldn't believe this guy wasn't calling her. And I was kind of just sitting there biting my tongue because it was like real fresh after a funeral, and I had just buried my mom, and I couldn't believe she was there. She was at the funeral, and I just couldn't believe that she was talking about this so much. And I kind of just realized in that moment, I didn't say anything. I said, I'm sorry that he's not calling, but I kind of went home that night and went into work the next morning like a robot and booked a one-way ticket to the Caribbean. I did it so that I could go home first. I could figure out the lease, not leave my roommates stranded, I gave a month and a half weeks notice instead of 2 weeks notice, kind of help my dad get through the first set of holidays. And the day after Christmas, I moved to St. John. So that was the beginning of kind of the leaps of faith and figuring stuff out. So it wasn't, and after that, it was kind of a lot of movement, a lot of change, but my wedding photography sustained me, and I was able to do these different things once I left New York, just because it was so expensive there that everything I've done since has been, a third of the cost it ever was living there.
That's true. From an expense standpoint, you can beat New York just about anywhere else.
Yes, absolutely. And I did start a GoFundMe for gas money when I began the trip. And I made sure that not only financially to be able to stay with people, but also comfort-wise and connection to the community-wise, I wanted to make my hosts a big part of the trip. So I didn't realize how big a part they would become. I kind of started it off saying, if anyone has an aunt in Texas or a cousin in California or, a friend in Pennsylvania that would let me crash on their couch as I traveled through, let me know. It really branched from there. I would be in a coffee shop doing some work in Oklahoma, and someone would see my T-shirt, because I pretty much wear the same outfit every day. I have a couple of shirts that say "More Good" and jeans and sneakers, and I call it my uniform. People would see that and say, "I like your shirt," and I would tell them what it was, and they would say, "Oh, I have this amazing friend in Colorado." Well, I'd stay with her. Or someone would have an old relative in this state, and I'd stay with them. It was very much word of mouth and connection, and it kind of just blossomed from there. And the hosts have been huge for me because I'm just one person alone in the middle of the country right now, very far from anything I know, in an area for the first time. And these are total strangers, and they're opening their doors and giving you a hug and welcoming you into their home, showing you around their community, connecting you with stories, feeding you dinner, making you feel like family, which is really cool and very comforting for me. And for my dad, who is very stressed out about this trip.
What is your dad doing now as you travel across the country?
He's still working. He has a lumberyard on Long Island, New York, and he's still working. And my siblings have all started families. I began the trip with one niece, and now I have 6.5 nieces and nephews. So everyone else is doing good, and I get to go home when I shoot weddings and see them a little bit, which is something I've done on this trip that kind of sustains and keeps my business alive. Park the car in someone's driveway every few months and go back to New York for a week or two, shoot a bunch of weddings, and get back on the road.
Well, you spend so much time on the road. I do have to ask you a few questions about the logistics of that. How many states have you been in so far?
So Indiana is my 41st state.
So you have 9 more states to go.
Yeah. And Alaska and Hawaii are on that list, so I'll have to fly there.
Now, is the trip going to end when you get to that 50th state, or are you going to go back to some other states and keep it going?
The trip itself on the road will be ending then for like the research aspect. I think that because then I have to put it all together. The plan is to put it all together and then eventually, get the book together. And then also I'd really love to write my own story of the journey and all the kindness I received and the people that I stayed with and that part of the trip. And then kind of branch out into another project, coupling my wedding photography with More Good and call it More Love, and kind of do love stories around the world and maybe branch out, outside of the U.S. also. And so I do have a travel bug, and I do like to travel, and I love connecting with people. And there's just so many incredible people that will just welcome you in and help you out when they believe in what you're doing. So it would be cool to figure something like that out. I would probably have to figure out a little bit more financially with that plan, but that is something I've always really loved. I have a lot of stuff to put together after I park the car. The car hasn't been back to New York at all. So once I drive into New York, it's kind of putting it all together. So I haven't really thought much past that.
Well, the car you've been driving is your mother's old blue Subaru, and I've seen photos of it where you've decorated it with stickers from all of the places that you've been. And it looks like a real road warrior car now, doesn't it?
Yeah. I try to condense it to just the stickers of like the states for the most part, because if I put every town on there or every organization I talk to or all that stuff, you won't even see the color of it anymore.
As far as the stories go, how do you find the stories outside of, well, I shouldn't even say that. I know how you find the stories. It's on your website. People respond and you hear about them word of mouth. But you probably hear so many stories. What stories meet your criteria for what is a good story? And maybe what stories don't meet that criteria?
So it ranges. I mean, the stories, like the M&M story I told you, is one type. They're, people buying someone food at a diner, that kind of little action. Then there's also the stories of, the person that donated their kidney to a complete stranger. And then there's the families that maybe go through a tragedy. They lose their son and they start a scholarship in his name, and they've sent 12 kids to college in honor of that. And kids that wouldn't be able to afford otherwise and now come and visit them on the holidays. So kind of turning some darkness that was put on them into this really beautiful light. And so it's quite a range. I pretty much meet with anyone. If there's people and I can make time to meet them that want to meet, I meet them. And sometimes they're just talking for a little while, and maybe they don't know exactly what you're doing, but maybe they just needed a friend, or maybe they needed to hear some positive stories. And so I try to kind of make time just to listen a lot of it, because you just learn so much from listening. And since I'm able to be out here and I'm able to be in their town, in their state right now, why not sit down with them for a cup of coffee? But the majority of the stories, I would say, are some kind of kindness or positivity that has come that they want to focus on that impacted their life, or how they were able to be an inspiring version of that story and turn something not great into something good. Whether they lost their legs and arms in an accident or a shooting, or, it's just such a range of inspirational people that have stories of hope. And then also just the stories in general. I love when people have the stories where they've been on the receiving end of the act of kindness and how they've benefited, like that woman from the M&M story.
Well, you've alluded to some of the stories I wanted to ask you about, so I thought now might be the best time as any to talk about some of those stories. The one that you mentioned, or actually I think it was two sisters, that they lost a father who had a kidney problem, and they both donated kidneys. I really love that story.
Yeah, that was really cool. And it's always cool to talk. So someone told me about them. I was traveling into Chicago. I had posted that I would be in Chicago next. And my host, who was a young girl of, a connection of a connection of a connection, I had stayed with her in North Dakota. And her sister worked with the brother of those girls. And so she said, I think that my sister's coworker has a story. I'm not sure. Let me see if I can connect you. Well, she ended up connecting me with them, and it was the week they were donating. So I was actually in the hospital with them on the second day. The one sister donated on Thursday, and the other sister donated on Friday. And I was there Friday afternoon with the mom and the brother and these two sisters, which was really cool to be part of that. And this family has stayed in touch with me. The brother and the mom check in on me, and the sisters check in, and it was just a cool connection. But we sat there and we talked, and they told me about how, their father had actually received a kidney from the oldest brother first. And that saved his life for 8 years. He was doing really well. And for them to just witness that, for them to grow up with a father who was always sick, always having issues, and then to see that 180 because he got a kidney, they immediately wanted to do that for someone else. I mean, they were just like, we want to donate. They wanted to donate to him, but he was too sick to receive a kidney again. So when he passed away, they ended up deciding to donate a kidney. And it was just a kind of cool thing, because I think a lot of the time when they were asked about it, and I know the hospital highlighted what they were doing, and then I think they did just get on Good Morning America. I'm not sure. I was sending it to them. I know a lot of people are pushing that story because it's just such a great story. But when I got to talk to them, it's just me. I'm not like a big newscaster or anything like that. I'm just sitting in this waiting room with them as if I'm family all of a sudden. And I was asking them a lot about their dad. And the one sister said, whenever he would drop us off at school, he would always say every day when we were getting out of the car, make the day better for somebody else. And she's like, I always remembered that. And it was just so cool, because it's like, wow, okay, well, I don't know if you had this in mind. I mean, you guys really knocked it out of the park by saving 2 lives, and that definitely made someone's day better. But it was just such a cool thing to see. I mean, this one little thing that their dad would say every day, I mean, that to me was like the impetus, like the beginning of it, and making me, I mean, they were amazing. The family was just like, it was a bunch of angels.
Well, you have two extremes. You've already talked about that small act of kindness where someone gave someone else a bag of M&Ms that they never forgot for 30 years. And now this. And in between, you have so many other stories. But there was a story that, and you said you like those stories where someone's on the receiving end. And I thought one of the stories that you found was one of those that stuck out. And it was a woman who lost her arm in an accident. And she worked in a cafe. And she had a number of strangers that volunteered to take her shift while she recovered. Do you recall that one?
Yes. Oh my gosh, that was a very long time ago. So she had actually almost lost her arm, but they were able to put it back on. So she does have her arm, but she did go through, she was in the hospital for a while, and she went through a lot of trauma with that. And the people at the coffee shop and surrounding coffee shops, like an hour away, were donating their shifts so that they could cover all her shifts. So she was still getting money because she had these hospital bills that were piling up and all these different things. And the story continued, and I apologize because my head is about blown up these days with so many stories. But I know that it continued, and she was able to participate in a competition, which was really important to her because of all the people that helped her in some way. And I can't remember exactly how the story ended, but I remember that she was able to do something that she didn't think she was going to get to do because all these people kind of came together for her. But yeah, there's just been so many moments like that where something happens to someone and these people just kind of pull together. And, and I think that's the concept with a lot of people. I think we all want to help. And it's just that we don't know what to do. Someone down the block loses, husband or child or this or that. We're just showing up with lasagna. We don't know what to do, but we want to help in some way. And so I think it's a really beautiful thing when you see that right away. some of the stories of the things people do is so cool. I mean, I know people bring food or, they do this or that, but one person told me, she was going through something. I think she had lost her dad, but she was also going through chemo treatments. And someone came over to the house. They just said, give me your keys for a second. They took her car. They went, they filled it up with gas. They got an oil change and they brought it back. And she hadn't done that in months. She hadn't thought about that. She didn't care. I mean, she was probably low on gas in general because she's always driving. But it was just like those tiny little things that, you don't have time to think about. But then the fact that like some random person is just thinking of that for you. Those are some of the really cool stories.
That's true. And so many people, they look for something to do, as you said. And so when the problem is very easy to identify, they know what to do. There was a waitress that you talked about who had rent money stolen from her car. And she was a waitress, so she must have mentioned this to one of her customers. So what did her customer do? Her customer went across the street to an ATM and left money for her on the table when the customer left.
Yep. Immediately figured out, well, I can help this situation.
And then there was, in Nashville, you talked to a man who was a pharmacist, and you said he had an elderly customer who came to his drugstore and she got her medicine, and he started then taking her medicine to her house for her.
Yeah, and they started going to lunch with her. Yeah, so him and his wife, she lived alone I think she was like in kind of a facility, not a nursing home, but more so like an elder community. And so him and his wife would go on Mondays when they both had time, and they would take her to lunch almost every Monday. And it was just like such a sweet little thing. And they brought it up like it was nothing. Like we were talking about something that must have reminded them of her. And so they brought her up and I said, who is that? And then they kind of explained the story. And I was like, what? Are you guys not thinking to tell me these things? I mean, these are the stories I'm looking for, but people are so modest, they don't think their story is big enough, or they don't think that that's important. Of course, why wouldn't everyone do that? But not everyone is doing that. And sometimes when they hear that story, then maybe they will, they start looking around a little bit more, for the people that maybe are a little bit more in need. I talked to a woman the other day who was at the grocery store, and she had walked around and saw an older man, and she was going through a lot. Her sister has been re-diagnosed with cancer, and it's terminal, and she's pretty young. And so here's the older sister, and she's kind of dealing with all of that, and she's walking around this grocery store kind of in a daze, and she noticed an older man, and he was just sitting down. They have benches in the grocery store that she lives in Wisconsin, and so he was just sitting on one of the benches to take a breather. And so she wanted to help him, but she felt kind of awkward. And I think that's a big thing with kindness too. We always feel a little awkward going out and offering our help. And so she kind of made a couple laps around him for 5 minutes and finally said, oh, this is so ridiculous. I'm going to go over there. So she went over and she said, can I help you grab anything else for your cart? And he said, oh yeah, I have to get to the frozen aisle and get these special ice pops. And so it was all the way across the store. So she said, I'll go grab them. So she went over and she grabbed them and she came back, and, he was really grateful, and they walked over together to check out, and she left the store and she got into her car and she started driving back to her house, and I think she was like almost home, and it started pouring rain, and it was warm out, like it was humid, and she was like, oh my gosh, his ice pops are gonna melt, like does he have anyone picking him up? It's raining. And she's like, I couldn't stop thinking about him. And so she has started to put together this little thing with her friends where they're going to offer to elder people in the community the chance for, if people can pick up your groceries for you, you can just run over, get your grocery list and go pick up your groceries for you and bring you back the receipt. Or if you need help, and you still want to get out of the house, she'll take you for the ride and go there. I mean, she's full-time working, a mom, and her sister is dying of cancer right now. And here she is thinking about what she can do for this other completely different person. And I just thought that was really cool.
It's probably therapeutic for her, though, isn't it?
Yes, I think that it is. And I think that whenever we help other people, it always, it's like they say, there's no selfless acts that we can do. And when we do them, it helps us too. So why wouldn't we want to do them?
That's right, because when you give, you get. There was another story that I loved that you talked about, and it involved a school teacher. Because oftentimes we hear about school teachers and that teacher that we never forget.
Yeah.
You described it as a third grade teacher who gave special attention to a student who was struggling.
Yes.
How many siblings did that student have?
Yes, it was a single mom. It was in Memphis. And she was in third grade. She was the oldest. And then she had 3 younger siblings, I believe. And they didn't have any money. The single mom, was working all the time. So the third grader was basically taking care of these children. And she was not doing well in school at all. And the teacher would just always kind of give her special attention. And she said she always remembered she would hold up her chin and say, look at me. She said, I believe in you. You can do this. Like, you just got to do this or that or whatever. But she always remembered, she said, I believe in you. And she looked me right into the eyes. And so she ended up, a lot of the other teachers were recommending she stay back. They thought she should stay back or she should get special needs or this or that. But that wasn't the case. It was just third grader was basically raising children at home. And so she ended up going on. And by the time she had gotten to 6th or 7th grade, I can't remember now, she got straight A's on her report card. And so she sent her report card to this teacher. And the teacher has it framed in her classroom now. I mean, this was probably 20 years ago, but she had it framed in her classroom for years and years and years. And it always really, the woman that was telling me this, who's, probably was in her late 30s now, she was telling me this story, and it was just really sweet. And she was going on and on about different things in her life and different acts of kindness. Well, 3 days later, she sends me a message and she says, so, after talking to you, I really was thinking about my teacher a lot, and I called the school and I was able to get, her phone number, and I am going to grab lunch with her this weekend. And it was just like such a cool thing. I was like, oh my gosh, and she's like, I'm so glad that, yeah. And so it's just a really cool, those little moments. And I think that, I just stayed with teachers actually. And it was really interesting because they were absolutely incredible people. I mean, just ridiculous. They didn't know me at all. They invite me in. We go to yoga, which was a really welcome and necessary moment for me. So the woman took me to yoga, and we got home, and the husband has left out a note and left us some snacks and made fresh baked cookies and was like, I can't wait for dinner tomorrow night. He was cooking a big feast. And I mean, just really over the top. So they're both teachers, and he was saying how one of his students had come in the other day and was like really grateful for his help with his graduation speech and this and that, and was like just saying like, you've been such a good teacher and this and that. And he's like, I just really wanted to thank you. And he's like, you don't have to thank me, just because he said you've inspired me to want to teach and this and that. He said, just turn around and do it. Whatever you felt like worked for you, just do it for the other people. Like, just turn around. You don't have to thank me. And I mean, he's just like, of course he would say that, he's just like, just such a ridiculously amazing person. But I think a lot of teachers, they deserve that thank you. And I think it's so cool too, when it's years and years later and you just reach out to them and say, listen, I'm still thinking about you and you made a really big impact on my life. I know I've had so many teachers like that, and I try to always remember to reach out to them once in a while. I had a French teacher that I still, once a year will send an email to, and he'll, reach out to me and my friends too. And we had a really close connection with him. And I think that's really important. I think we all deserve to get a thank you once in a while.
Well, we've talked about some stories that were small acts of kindness and some that were kind of part of a job or part of what you do for a living, and it becomes your own personal mission. But there was one story that you talked about that was just totally out of the blue, and it was an Uber driver.
Yes. So the Uber driver was from Sierra Leone, and he had come there and with a friend. So the story was actually about his friend, and the friend had been a doctor back in Sierra Leone. And when he got to the U.S., he couldn't get any work. My Uber driver worked for a cab company and then now worked for Uber also. But the friend, because of paperwork and everything, couldn't be a doctor here. And so he got a job doing a newspaper route. And he didn't have a place to stay, so he was staying in a shelter. And so he would do this newspaper route every day, and he was throwing the newspapers on the lawn one morning when it hit the lamp outside. And it was 4 a.m, 20 years ago in D.C. There was no security cameras. And so he had put a little note on the door anyway and offered to pay for said I'd be back to pay. Well, the man who owned the home happened to be getting back from a business trip and was home when he came back to try to pay. And he invited him in, and they had a cup of coffee and talked. And they, he found out a little bit about his life and talked about, the other guy's life. And then, long story short, that man ended up putting him up in a studio apartment and put him through medical school. And he is a doctor in DC now. And I think that story for me was such a huge moment, because not only was it just like a ridiculously nice story, but it was a story that I needed really badly in that moment, because while this trip is really beautiful and nice and fun, it's extremely challenging and exhausting and emotional because 95% of the stories do come from a tragedy or a dark place. And you're taking that in a lot. And you're trying to figure out communities and areas and places and strangers' homes all the time. And at that point, it had only been 2 months of the trip. And I was already very burnt out and very freaked out about what I had signed myself up to do, and very discouraged because I wasn't getting much traction in DC. I couldn't reach out to any local papers to try to have them help say, this person's here if you have a story, so that the community could reach out to me. It wasn't really about me. And the person I stayed with reached out to their neighborhood of 120 people and no one responded. And so it just felt like a really bad time for me. And had just gone through the holidays with strangers, which was great, but it was also really hard because I wasn't with my family and I was on the road and I was sick. So I think everything that could have possibly piled up on me at that moment did. And here I was sitting in an Uber thinking this is the last place, that I would find a story. And I was just it was raining, it was cold. I was on my way to a connection that ended up not even being a story. It was just a girl that wanted to hear my stories. And so it made me realize, because I said yes to her, to go meet her, even though it ended up being nothing, I got in that car. So I would have never gotten in that car. And as we pulled up to the coffee shop where I met her, he was finishing up his story and he was saying, it's because this guy did the right thing in his heart. And he left the note. And, he didn't have the money to pay and he didn't have to do that, but he did. And he turned around and he looked at me and he said, it's just like what you're doing. The most important work you'll ever do is the work you do with your heart. And then he turned back around and said, have a nice day. And I kind of got out of the cab and sat on the sidewalk crying for a minute before I had to pull it together and go inside. But yeah, that was definitely a huge moment for me.
What do you think motivates people to give an act of kindness?
Like I said, I think a lot of people want to give. And I think that there's a lot of times when they want to do something and maybe there's a large percentage of the time where we don't because it feels awkward or uncomfortable or we're not sure. But I think that people are motivated to do good. I think that, it does feel like, you do get it back and not to just do something because you'll get something, but because it genuinely makes you feel a little bit better to know that there's some type of purpose. I think we're all kind of always searching for purpose. And I think that when we do these little things and we can make a difference in someone's life, even for a moment, that's a purpose. And that's what we want.
Well, you've seen so much. After all you've seen anecdotally, is there a pattern to the type of person that is likely to give an act of kindness?
Usually it's the person that's been through the trenches, the people that have gone through some pretty hard stuff. I think that they're able to look around and see people instead of just assuming, you have a friend that's on Instagram with their family and their perfect baby with a bow on its head and you think, oh, how perfect they are and how lucky they are and things are great. But that's usually almost never the case. We kind of all mask ourselves a little bit on social media to, I guess, fake ourselves out if we think we can fake our friends out. But I think the people that see through that really pay attention, that really ask, how are you? Instead of just saying, how are you doing? And then they start answering and it's taking a little too long and you're like, oh gosh, why'd I even ask? I think those people that kind of really pay attention, those are the people that are doing the good deeds and that are figuring out, not just little things they can do, but really like, filling up that gas tank or changing the oil, kind of putting themselves in those people's shoes. But it's almost always people that are going through or went through some hard times themselves.
Well, I think you're a good example of that. You've been through a hard time, and now here you are through this massive effort doing a major act of kindness. What has it done for you so far?
Oh, gosh, it's been all over the place for me. I think that, I meet people like the woman that I had spoken about actually in the Star Tribune. Her name was Julie Dumbo, and she was from Kansas, and she had walked in a phone store at the wrong time in the wrong place, and it was getting robbed. She got shot 3 times. She lost her arms and her legs from her elbows and knees down. She was in the hospital for about 144 days, I want to say. When she got out, a week later, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she gets herself up every day. She goes into hospitals and she helps out and motivates people that maybe have lost a limb unexpectedly. She goes into schools and speaks with them. She spoke to the school where the kid that robbed and shot her went in a pretty bad area. And she just keeps giving. and motivating and inspiring people. And to me, that moment, her story was that a man who had a lot of money had bought her two mechanical arms. They're like $275,000. Her insurance wasn't covering it, as if she's not going through enough. Now she has to deal with that. And a man actually delivered them to her house and gave them to her as a present. And that was her little story of an act of kindness. But to me, she was the story. I mean, I will be driving sometimes and I will be so tired and so exhausted and so overwhelmed with emotions, because so many of these stories are so intense and sad, really. And you're taking a lot of that in, and I'll, my tire will be low, or I'll be running low on gas money or this or that. And I'll think, this is such a small potato problem. I mean, Julie is walking around with no arms and legs and getting through her day like I can get through mine. And so, to see her, to meet her, to see how inspiring she was, and so many people that I've met that have been through so much and are still smiling, going out there and giving back, they're like my fuel. It kind of keeps me going no matter how hard it gets. It's just like, I want their stories to be heard.
I have one final question for you. If your mother were to see all of this today, what would she tell you?
Oh, gosh. She is probably up there having a heart attack. She was like, I'm going to heaven to put my feet up finally and have a glass of wine and play some Scrabble. And now I'm on full-time angel duty watching over your crazy self driving around alone. So I think she'd be like, oh, my gosh, what are you doing? But I think, obviously, I would hope she would be proud. I mean, I think that she was one of those moms that told you, she always made you believe in yourself and, was always telling you how proud she was of you. So you feel that on the trip, and it kind of keeps you going.
Mary Latham, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
To learn more about Mary Latham and her trip across the country called The More Good Tour, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook group that you can join, a Facebook page you can follow, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.